Hey there. Okay, so I'm going to be doing 4 simple macrame bracelets for you this time around. And this is the first of the 4. And what this one is just simply it's square knots. The whole thing. Square knots and 1 overhand knot. And this is just super simple, but it's really tiny, so it's micro macrame. And I hope you have fun making it. I had fun with it. So what I'm using is I've got a vintage antique shank button here. It's glass. I got that a long time ago, so it's from my stash. And also what I'm using for my cord on this is also from my stash. This is vintage. It's crochet cotton and it's super fine. And you should be able to find something comparable to this currently. And this one is mercerized cotton, and it's called sand silk, which it just at the sheen that they've gotten on this cotton is just so pretty. It just makes it look like silk. It doesn't actually give me an indication as to its size, although it is made in America, made in Massachusetts, so yay. Alright, so this is the American Thread Company. It's vintage. This is probably, I'm going to guess it's from the 30s or the 40s. It's been in my stash for a long time, and it's actually part of my stash that I inherited from somebody who had it in their stash for an awful long time. So I'll just set that aside. So what I have here is I have roughly 7 feet of our cord. I've got 2 strands of it, and for my beads here I'm using these are just regular glass beads. These are kind of, you know, the pale green shade. It kind of makes it look like sea glass. But aside from using this green, other options that you might want to try is this is more of a natural looking shell bead. And this one is this bead, but in a pale blue. Either of these colors would look nice with this bracelet. Alright, so what I'm going to do on my cord, since it's just simple square knots, I don't need to fold my cord in half because I'm only tying knots with two of the 4 strands that I'm going to wind up with once I thread this through my button. So I'm going to measure off 20 inches, and that's going to be the point where I'm going to be tying my knot. So I'm using my large eye needle just to get my cord onto my button, and then I'm going to measure 20 inches. So there's 15 and another 5, so it's roughly 20 inches right there, and that is where I'm going to locate my button. And now I'm just going to tie an overhand knot to secure the button in its location. And I'm going to just get my cord up as close as possible to that button, make that knot just really tight. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a pin and secure our piece to the board. And I'm just organizing my cords. So I know these 2 short cords are going to be the center, and for the longer strand of the cord, I'm wanting to untangle it because, of course, as usual, using this much cord, it's going to get tangled up on you. There we go. All nice and untangled. And as usual, on the left-hand side, you're really not going to be passing your cord back and forth a lot, or at all. It's the right-hand cord that moves back and forth. So to keep track of your cord, and to not let it get all tangled up and messed up on you, I'm just wrapping up my left hand cord and giving it a bit of a twist and tying it to itself just really loosely. I'm not pulling that tight because I need to get more length out of that later on, just so I know where my left hand cord is at. The right hand cord is going to be all loose because it needs to go back and forth. Alright, so before I get too much further on this as well, I'm going to go ahead and string all of my beads onto my crochet cotton, and let's see if it will actually let us do two cords at a time for this stringing of the beads, or if I have to back it off and do one at a time. Yep. I'm gonna have to just string my beads on one cord at a time. It's just a bit too much volume going through the hole on the bead, but both cords will go through all the beads. There are 34 of these little beads that we're going to be using on here. I'm going to go off camera and finish stringing all the beads, and then I'll be back in a bit. Okay, so I have my 34 beads on the first strand. Now I'm going through and making sure I've got them on the second strand. So what I'm doing is I'm putting pressure on the beads to pull the cord flat against one side, so when I thread through, I'm not catching my cord. I'm not sewing through it, which would cause a problem if I did. And these are 4mm beads. I don't think I mentioned their size earlier. There's not a lot of pattern to what we're doing, but we're doing our beads in two distinct sections for this bracelet, and there are 17 beads in each section. So what I'm going to do, once I get all these on both of my strands, I'm going to divide them up in their sections of 17, just to help me keep track of where I'm at in my overall pattern as I go along. Okay, so we do have all 34 beads are here. I counted to make sure. So what I want is I want them in groups of 17. Also, to make sure I don't lose my beads off the end of my tying cord, I'm going to double over my cord and just make a bit of an overhand knot here at the bottom. And so these are the last 17 beads, and I just want to do a bit of a loop here. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and let the beads get caught up in it because it'll make it easier to untie later. So these are the second set of 17. So this is the first set of 17 that we'll be using, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to let the beads slide down to the end of the cord. They'll be off camera, but that way it's using gravity to help keep this cord in line for me, so it's not going to cause me problems. And actually I need to flip my button over because orientation for my left and right cord was not being happy with that orientation. So there we go, we're better. So we've got our left cord and our right cord. So basically what we'll be doing is we're just doing square knots. So we're going to do 11 square knots to start with, because this first section where your square knots are at, this is going to be on the underside of your wrist, not really that visible. So that's why I'm trying to give us a bit of a length of square knots before we start our beads. I'm going to go ahead and fast forward now to get the rest of the 11 and be back in a bit. Alright, so that's 11 square knots right there. And at this point we're going to bring up our first bead. And then we're going to do 3 square knots. And then bring up a bead. Just keep repeating that. And it is important that as you're doing this, that you keep your 2 center cords side by side, because that does affect how your square knot lays down. You need to make sure that your cords are square with each other, and that's actually what adds to your square knot being a square knot. Okay, so we've got to the point where this is bead number 17 that I brought up, and I'm having to reposition my cord on the board because I was getting really close to the edge. Alright, so now we're going to just do a set of 11 square knots, and then we're going to start doing this again for the balance of our piece. I don't believe I mentioned this earlier. This is actually a wrap bracelet, so it should wrap around the wrist twice. So this particular bracelet should come out to 16 inches in length when we're done. So to adjust the size, you would just decrease the number of beads that you're doing. Okay, so I'm back. So I have completed all the knots. So we have 11 square knots at the beginning, then alternating with beads and 3 square knots for 17 beads. Then we have another 11 square knots, and then alternating again with a bead and 3 square knots until we're to the end, and finishing off with a final 11 square knots. So this is where we start prepping for our finish. And so what we're going to do at this point, I'm going to pin things down to hold it still. We're going to create a braid. This braid is going to help create the loop that's going to go around our button at the other end for the closure. So I'm actually just going to do a 3-strand braid. I'm going to use the 2 center cords together as one of the strands. Okay, so there's our 1 1/4 inches for our braid. So now we're just going to bend it back, and now we're going to test to make sure our button will go through that little loop. And yeah, we've got plenty of room. In fact, we can actually take a little space off of there. We don't want it to have it be too loose, and yeah, that fits a lot better. Alright, so what I want to do now, and this is the challenging part, I'm actually going to use this binder clip to, after I line things up, I'm going to use a binder clip to hold my layers together so I can do the next stage, which is doing a square knot going the other direction. So what I'm wanting to do is, if all of my cords will behave themselves and I can get them all entangled, what I'm doing is I'm tying 3 square knots going the opposite direction from the direction we were previously going with our square knots. And what this is going to do is it's going to anchor the end of our loop. The first one definitely comes out looking a little strange because you're going from braid to square knot. I'm adding a couple more square knots. So I did test to make sure that my loop is still the right size. And these square knots, I'm going to make sure that they're really nice and snug, because what they're doing is they're actually anchoring our loop, and it's important to make sure that the loop is anchored really well. That way it doesn't get distorted in its size, and it still performs its function. And the other reason I'm doing these knots super tight is I don't want to add a lot of bulk to the end. Right here where I'm doubling up basically on my square knots. So that's 3. Looks like it probably could use a couple more. Let's go ahead and do 5 altogether right here. And that's 5. Okay, so what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to snip off these 2 short cords, because these are the remains of our center cord that all of our beads are on. So we don't need those anymore. Okay, so we've completed our final square knot. So we have 5 on here coming this direction from where we have created our loop. And what we want to do is we want to actually catch these ends with some whipping. And to do that, I'm actually going to trim these off, because I'm going to use one of these cords to do the whipping with. And they're both a good length, so it doesn't matter which one I use. So what I want to do is I want to be able to catch these ends within the whipping, and actually I'm going to let them go the other direction. I'm going to tuck them into my loop here just to control them so they stay out of the way and behave their little selves, so they can get caught up in the whipping without causing any problems. Alright, so now we're going to take the cord we're going to do the whipping with. We made a loop, and we're laying it over the top of the areas that we want to do the whipping. So I want to catch from here to about there for the whipping. That way I'm completely catching the ends from the last square knot. So now I'm just going to trim off all my excess. So this is the section we're wrapping with. This is the tail from the loop, and these are the remaining tails from the final square knots, and they're all caught up inside the whipping, and everything's all nice and trimmed. Okay. Alright, so here's our first of 4 bracelets, and this is a wrap, so it'll go around twice, and then there we go. And it's a good fit too. It's not too loose. You really don't want your loop to be too loose, although this one probably could have been a scotch bigger, but it works. It does its job. And there we go. Our first bracelet. It's a Micro-Macrame beaded wrap. So there we go. There's our first one. Now we're going to move on to our next bracelet.